of the Wealthy Boss Show. I am joined today by two special guests, and this is a landmark day because it is the first time that I've had not one, but two guests on the show at a time. We had a little bit of trouble figuring the tech out, but hey, we're here, we made it work, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I'm joined today by Jessica Rhodes and Margie Feldhune of Interview Connections. So I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, so you can fight over who wants to go first. Just tell us a little bit about yourselves personally and what you do for Interview Connections.
Sure. So let's see, starting personally, I am married and I have two kids. I started my business about 4.5 years ago. I thought I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom when I had my son. So I started doing freelance virtual assistant work for my dad. And then that kind of took off and I started booking interviews and podcasting really exploded. So I kind of went from being a work-at-home, stay-at-home mom to like, the long story short is having kind of a full-blown business and agency. We have a team of 7 here in our Rhode Island office.
So the opposite of being a stay-at-home mom, essentially.
Yeah, I didn't actually want to be a stay-at-home mom, turns out. So, but it was good for a few months.
There you go.
Yeah, that's just kind of the overview. I'm the founder and CEO here, so I kind of oversee everything, do a lot of like marketing and kind of vision, futuristic work for the company.
Awesome. Margie.
Cool. So I am Jessica's Chief Operating Officer at Interview Connections. I do a lot of looking at spreadsheets.
Someone's got to.
Yeah. And talking about how we need systems for stuff. Sometimes I say it calmly. Sometimes I hear that I'm yelling.
Just strongly suggesting.
Yeah. And Jess and I have known each other for a while. I was kind of very different than Jess kind of getting married and having kids. I was sort of rootless. I traveled a lot and really hadn't found myself in my career path. And Jessica and I had worked together for a nonprofit canvassing when we were both fresh out of college. And we ended up reconnecting, and I was a contractor for Interview Connections working for Jess remotely for a while. And that has evolved into this amazing position. So that was really great.
Awesome. And just for our listeners this might be their first experience with Interview Connections, what's the tagline, what's the elevator pitch of what Interview Connections does for people?
Yeah, we're the leading guest booking agency for podcasters and guest experts. So we work with entrepreneurs to book them for interviews on podcasts in their niche. And we also work with hosts who need guests, and we find them people to interview.
I love that. That's so brilliant because there's so much just legwork involved in relationship building and etiquette that gets kind of dicey of, how do I put myself on show? So I think your offerings are so unique and needed and brilliant, and I'm just I'm excited to hear that what I learned that you existed at a podcast movement. So
yeah, thank you.
Cool. So my first question is for Jessica. So you manage a team of 7. You are not a stay-at-home mom. You have many people that you're responsible for, many people whose salaries you're responsible for, and then ultimately your bottom line. So, but every time I hear you, I wanted to make sure to have the two of you come together because you are co-hosts on Rock's podcast as well as your other podcast, which we'll chat about in a minute. And you always seem to have so much fun together. Like, I'm super jealous every time I hear you guys riff off of each other. I'm like, oh, I want that. So how do you infuse that sense of fun while still running a serious business and maintaining that bottom line? How do you make that a priority in your day-to-day functions as a staff?
Yeah, I mean, part of it I think is just sort of natural because like we just both have kind of a good sense of humor. And I don't know if you follow like stand-up comedians or see stand-up comedy, but
not a whole lot. I have a couple, but not.
Yeah. We were actually just laughing about this like not too long ago, kind of talking about this interview. And a lot of stand-up, the better the stand-up comedian, the more traumatic and insane their life is, because they kind of find humor in the insanity of their life. And
that makes sense.
this
laugh or cry.
yeah, like this past year has been really crazy, you know, like hiring employees and moving into a pretty big office space and just everything that goes along with it. Like, we really couldn't get through the insanity without like having a sense of humor. So it's sort of like a survival mechanism. Like, we have to laugh through the pain.
They love their job, people.
Like, you just have to laugh at the insanity. Like, if you can't laugh at the insanity, you'll go crazy. And that doesn't mean there aren't times where we're like sad or just like freaking out over the stress, but we really do just joke a lot. And it helps that we each like have our sense of humors are like really aligned. So in a way, I just feel like I didn't like, it's not like I've done something to make us have a fun dynamic. It's just, we both kind of value like making life a little bit lighter, I guess. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's partly just that our sense of humors align, and we both like have a similar balance of being really serious about customer experience and stuff getting done, and then being really silly about everything we can possibly be silly about. And I think it's been a good balance.
I like that. So you're really just, you know, true to yourselves and true to your personality, and you let that shine through in your brand. And that's something that I've worked on over the years in my own brand. And I'm not a funny girl. I'll never be the one cracking jokes, but I feel like I've come a long way in being more and more authentic, just in like not taking yourself so seriously. When I first started, you know, the first iteration of my business, which looks absolutely nothing like at all like what it looks like today, I felt like this need to like pretend that I was this big, huge corporation and, you know, use language like, you know, we, even though it was just me and I was working a day job. Like, I feel like that is something that is being more and more brought to the forefront by entrepreneurs, especially like in a really competitive space with entrepreneurs, is the more that you're yourself, the more you actually stand out and connect with people, which is great.
Yeah. And I can really relate to that. Like, cause when I started my business, my dad is a business coach. I really kind of learned a lot from him. And when your first mentor in business is, you know, a 55-year-old like conservative man, like you don't, you know, like being like funny and silly and like, I mean, not that he doesn't teach that, but it was just like, you know, we have different personalities and like different definitions of funny. So, you know, it just took me a while to kind of branch out, you know, like I actually spoke at his event recently. And one of the things I talked about was like the first conference I went to, I'm in like this gray like blazer and it's so boring. And now it's like even letting more of a fun personality shine through, you know, my clothing choices and my hair color and like all of that, just kind of taking risks and just being more comfortable with like attracting the right kind of people. So it definitely takes time to get to that point where you're comfortable like being a little bit more zany. That's something that Margie definitely brought to the podcast, because she's never been like, well, I don't know if you would say this, but I've never seen Margie as like the buttoned up like business person. So when I brought her on the show, it was like, it wasn't long before she was like yoga, cats, and
and that's what you're known for now.
yeah.
Love it. So let's talk about your podcast. So I first started listening to your first podcast, Rock the Podcast, which is a podcast about podcasting, and all of those, right? But you started a new podcast recently as well that you both co-host both of those shows. Tell us how your new podcast, Women's Slaying, is going.
It's going great. It's been, we've been saying for a while that we wanted to kind of branch out from Rock the Podcast because we didn't want to bore that audience with like all these tangents about other stuff that was unrelated to podcasting that we wanted to talk about. And we originally were like, this is going to be such a funny show. Like, we're going to have
a comedy podcast.
I know, you totally caught me off guard when you gave your pitch, like in Rock the Podcast. I was like, oh, this is going to be like fun and lighthearted. And then the first one, you're talking about like grief. And I'm like, oh, but I love it. So, evolution happened just very quickly.
Yeah. So, well, if you've heard the first episode, you know we recorded at the world famous Comedy Store. Again, thinking this is going to be so funny, like perfect
Right,
to be at the
set the
Comedy
stage.
Store. And it just, I think it's like the same way businesses evolve. It's to be true to us and what we were thinking about. It just wasn't always light stuff. And I think we do bring humor to how we talk about it, and we do joke a lot about dark topics. But I think to be able to be authentic and tell the truth, we couldn't really control what was coming out, and it wasn't as much a comedy show as we thought.
Yeah, I think like the big purpose that we find in women-splaining is the ability to just be like 100% raw and honest about like real life stuff, whereas Rock the Podcast is not the appropriate place to be like, I'm depressed right now. Like, not the right show to talk about that on.
Right.
But I find that there's a lot of value in being open and like public about that, like in the right space.
I love that you bring that up, because I'm always interested, going back to that previous point that we were talking about being authentic in your business and making sure that your personality comes through with your brand and being vulnerable and authentic and genuine. But then there's also that point, it's like, well, it's still a business. You want to be purposeful with how much you share. And you also, it may not feel safe to spill your entire life story to your customers. I kind of struggled with this. I recently had a death in the family, and it was a very contentious background. And so there was a piece of me that's like, well, maybe I should share this, as a self-care topic for my audience, but also almost felt like a little too much to go there for my own safety, let alone for my audience. So, I briefly mentioned it. I've shared, some lessons learned from it. But where do you think, and everyone's going to have a different opinion about this, but where do you think, as business owners, being authentic, being ourselves, where do we draw that line between being genuine, being open, and oversharing?
That's a great question. And I think it just goes back to like sharing things at the right place and the right time with the right people. And even when you feel like you're in the right place at the right time with the right people, some people are going to be very uncomfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that. Like, we've experienced that with women-splaining. Like, there are people that are like, I can't listen to this show. And there are people that are very close to me, and it has been hurtful. But at the same time, there's people that are close to me that listen and are like, this is amazing, and I'm learning so much more about you. And so it's a double-edged sword, I guess. Some people are not going to be comfortable with you being vulnerable, but I think it's a risk worth taking, because the people that do want to hear your open and honest, vulnerable stories and like be there for you, it's so worth it. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I think this might not be totally answering your question, but something that's helpful. It can be hard when you're still so in it to share. And I think it's talking about your own safety and sharing. I think it's really okay to wait, take care of yourself. And once you have a little distance, it's easier to find the words to tell the story in a way that feels coherent and true for you. So if you're in it, I think it's okay to not tell it right away until you've got you've come out the other end a little bit. Yeah,
that's wise. And I always try to run everything through the filter of, what is my community going to gain from this?
Sure.
Yeah. And so I think that's always a good question for us to ask ourselves when looking at how much of ourselves to bring into our brand is, what purpose does this serve?
Right.
As opposed to being a replacement for therapy, right?
Right. Yeah. And we both definitely are outspoken about loving therapy, because the topics I would discuss in therapy are obviously different than what I would broadcast. Although I keep it kind of close, and my my reasoning when I'm thinking about like what purpose is this serving, I know it means so much to me to hear people being honest on podcasts, and it really when they're sharing stuff that's uncomfortable, I feel like I'm not alone. So for me, it's worth it to even risk TMI and maybe like a little vulnerability hangover if even one person out there is like, okay, I'm not alone.
And we also edit our podcast too. So there are parts, like we go back and listen, and like there are chunks that I'm like, that can't be public, because like our conversations are so open,
Right.
and like probably every episode sounds like we're oversharing. You would be surprised at how much we actually put out.
I love it. So has that been, I mean, how many episodes are you into this now as of this recording?
Yeah, there's 4 episodes live,
Okay.
and we recorded episode 5 yesterday, so that'll be live in 2 weeks.
Okay, so how are you finding that, like, personally? Because you do share some pretty personal stuff, and as you mentioned, you created this space to be able to share more openly and honestly about life and not just about business. So how is that? You have been brave, you have been courageous. How has that been for you? Do you feel like you mentioned like the vulnerability hangover? Do you feel like even with each episode, is it getting easier? How has that process been for you personally to be able to put that all for people that you might not even ever see that are listening in on the other end?
What do you think?
It's been mostly good. Sometimes I won't listen to the episodes.
Yeah.
I mean, we listen to them to edit, but I
Right.
usually won't listen to it because it's just a little too much.
Yeah.
But the feedback has been great. There are
Right.
vulnerability. The first episode we did, I just like vomited the entire story. Like Jen, like totally blindsided our guest.
She had no idea.
She had no idea about any of this stuff. I mean, it was like,
Right.
so after that, I was like afraid to hear it. And then it got such a good response from people who said it meant something to them. And that like cured my vulnerability hangover. Cause like knowing it mattered to them was like, okay, what about you?
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's been a great experience. Like even for going on 5 episodes in, the show means a lot to us. Like, again, our first idea was like, let's start a funny show where we talk about TV shows we like, and and now it's like something totally different. But again, just going back to being really honest and vulnerable, like people feel like they're less alone. They appreciate you having conversations about things that most people don't talk about. And I think because it's on a podcast where there can be like an open conversation, like I would probably never go to Facebook and like write a long post about the stuff that I talk about on the show, but with public forums, one's appropriate, one's just going to get a lot of annoying comments. So,
Right.
yeah, it's been really good. But I mean, like I said before, it's also hard because sometimes like people aren't okay with it. And then you also have to like try to not take stuff personally, because if like one episode doesn't have as many downloads and you're like, oh, like you like,
was it something I said?
you're not supporting me in my depression.
Oh, absolutely. It's hard not to take that personally. I mean, even, much lesser things that I've shared through an email, a heartfelt email that I wrote for my email newsletter, and then I hear an unsubscribe, like,
yeah,
you suck.
Yeah.
You heartless soul.
Yeah.
So I can totally understand that for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that brings up the point that what we do, whether it's in business or the projects that we take on, where we show up and bring our gifts to the world, having that mission mindedness and being more concerned with what our audience is going to get from it, what our community is going to get from it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes such a good point, is that when you have that courage and when you're more focused on serving other people with it, it, like you said, it makes that risk worthwhile, which I think is a really beautiful point.
Yeah, it really is about, I mean, it's therapeutic to be able to talk about this stuff, but we talk about it all the time anyway, like outside the show. I think the big reason that we love sharing it on the podcast is because most people aren't, like, even a lot of our like close friends, like just aren't having really deep conversations.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so important because it makes people feel less alone. It makes them feel more normal. Like I had people that listen and they told me, I think I've actually been going through a little depression. I didn't realize it until like I, heard you guys talk about on Women's Planning, because everyone feels like, oh, I'm normal. Like there's nothing wrong with me. But it's like, maybe you are going through something and you need a little bit of help. Like,
yeah.
And I know that was like my kind of experience for a long time. I'm like, I don't have mental illness, and like, maybe I don't have like severe clinical mental illness where I need pain, like, antidepressants, but that doesn't mean there's not periods of depression where seeing a therapist can really help.
Right.
And I think that there's a huge stigma around therapy where people feel like, oh, well, if I'm not off the deep end, like I don't need that help. And I just think it's so important that people seek that help.
Right. Instead waiting till it's too late. And then we create that stigma that
Yeah.
if you need help for something, then you must have something really, really wrong with you.
Yeah.
Instead of embracing, like, how can I make this easiest? How can I make this best? How can I make this the healthiest? Instead of just really looking at that in these black and white terms. And I've been a big fan of therapy as well. I've had a therapist that I've been seeing for about 4 years now. And
Cool.
I think my life is so much better because I found the right one. I've been to another one that wasn't particularly helpful, but even just the act of going, I think kind of validated the intentions behind why I needed to go. And for sure, like in growing up in a very conservative, like Midwest family that doesn't ask for help and doesn't believe in that was really hard for me.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of shame. I didn't talk about it for a long time. But I would rather be like as happy and healthy as I can be.
Yeah.
And getting some help with that is, in my idea, just being smart.
Yeah, it's very preventative. Like the same as eating healthy and exercising. It's preventative care so that there aren't bigger problems. And
I love that. Yeah. I love looking at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because you don't want to wait until you have a major mental health crisis on your hands, right? There's a lot of fallout that can happen.
Yeah. It's like someone saying, well, I don't need to exercise. I'm not morbidly obese.
Right.
And it's like,
I haven't had a heart attack yet.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. Well, kind of channeling it then, we've talked about being yourself in your business. I'd love to hear some ways that you find yourself outside of your business. So what are some interests that you pursue outside of doing all the work that you do? How do you balance time for that? What would you like to do maybe in the future as you develop stronger processes and have, hopefully, it's always an entrepreneurial dream, more and more free time.
Yeah.
That elusive free time that we chase.
Yeah. So, I mean, we both do a lot of yoga. Yoga is definitely something that's a big interest. Margie's there like 5 days a week.
I'm a yoga teacher, by the way, so I fully endorse that.
Yeah. But I go to yoga like once or twice a week. I love that. Honestly, women's planning is a hobby. So that's something that's definitely really fun and enjoyable. And my 2 kids keep me really busy.
Yeah.
So them and I like to travel. Like one of my goals for 2018 is to go on a trip to another country, and I have no idea where or when I'm going to do that. Like I've been wanting to for a while, like take a trip that's not to a podcasting conference in San Diego. Which is where all my trips tend to take me, is like Texas, Florida, or San Diego. So I'd like to do something, just kind of experience a little bit of the world outside of my work.
Have you traveled before?
Not too much. Yeah, Canada doesn't count, I don't think. So
as lovely as it is.
Yeah.
Mark, what about you besides yoga? Do you have anything else that you really try to make a practice of so that you're not entirely entrenched in work all the time, which is easy to slip into as entrepreneurs?
Yeah, good question. I do a lot of yoga. I go pretty much every day after work, so that takes up a lot of my I don't do happy hours or anything during the week because I'm always at hot yoga, and then I have to shower, and by the time
time to go to bed.
Yeah, exactly. I try to have a morning routine where I read a little bit of Pema Chodron or we've been listening to the Oprah podcast, and she's got some really good guests. So I want to be a little more structured with that morning routine because I think I come and go from it. So I also love travel. My best friend lives in California and I'm in Rhode Island. So we organize at least one trip every year where we coordinate our vacation time and go somewhere. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah. What are some non-negotiables that you have to maintain? And I hate the term work-life balance, but for lack of a better term, what are some non-negotiables that you have, whether it's in regards to this is when I don't work, this is, or even just systems that you stick with within work to make sure that you're using your time effectively and really kind of being on top of your game?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is, and I'm definitely not perfect at this, but I work really hard to not answer or deal with work emails outside of 9 to 5, Monday through Friday.
Love it.
It's a little hard right now because we just got a virtual assistant in the Philippines. So I'll tend to jump online at 8 o'clock at night because she's just getting started, and I want to make sure that she has what she needs. So it's been a little bit, I've done a little bit of work like on nights and weekends just to make sure that she's got what she needs. But for the most part, like even if I see a client email on a Saturday and I'll have the time, like when I stopped responding to emails like on nights and weekends, like it really does like train your clients to not expect a response from you 24/7, which I think is so important. So really keeping like work inside business hours is something that I'm like pretty strict about.
Yeah,
Try
I
to
love
be.
that. Yeah. And I've learned that personally because I still work a day job, so I have to be structured about both. Right? So I have to be structured about not responding to. Now, there's always crises that pop up because it's a 7-day-a-week studio, but I'm pretty diligent about not checking emails when I'm not, quote unquote, working. But then there again, you have to have. Then I also have to have that set of boundaries in my business. So it's. I find that the clearer I make the rules because I'm balancing so much, the less anguish I have over it. And you do train yourself. Like, for me, I don't check email first thing in the morning. Yeah. I wait until I've had like my coffee and my mindfulness time and my quiet time. And at first it's hard because it's like, it's like an automatic instinct to check that, your thumb gets like trigger happy, but you do get used to it. And now it's like, I don't even think about it. So,
Margie, you have a lot of like things.
I'm a very regimented person.
We call her No Chill Feltune.
That's a nickname I gave myself, and everyone in my life is, but everyone who hears it is like, yeah.
You're no chill.
So it's weird because on the one hand, I am like a ridiculous and silly person, but I also put in place very regimented systems. And I think it's partly because like I identify as a creative and I can get really all over the place and unfocused. And so it helps me to streamline basic things like, like I eat every 3 hours. I wake up at the same time. I go to bed around the same time. And so I can kind of take those off my plate. I don't have to think about them so that I've freed up energy to focus on the real like innovation and problem solving. And that it's weird. I mean, people think I'm weird, but it really works for me.
I love it. And have you always been that way?
Kind of, but I think when I was younger, it wasn't in productive ways. I think I was trying to implement control to feel that, but it was in areas it wasn't effectively done. So now being older, I can like have an overview more of what's important, what my values are. So I think I'm better at prioritizing that. So I think I always wanted to do that, but I didn't have the discipline to really see where I should be doing stuff like that until I was older.
Like dig a layer deeper to look at what was serving through that. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. It's funny because I very much grew up like as a creative. Like I was a philosophy major in college. I was a musician. I traveled in a band. And sometimes I look back now that I'm in my mid-30s and I think, what's become of me? Like I live off of Trello and schedules and policies and regimens. But at the same time, I think, when you're creative and you're ambitious, the more that you can actually bring systems and processes to bringing all those dreams to life, like that's just kind of what it takes. So it takes all that vision and that ambition and all that desire to live life fully. But it also takes some pretty darn good to-do lists and policies and rules and schedules to make it all happen. So it's always kind of a balancing act, right?
Definitely.
I love it. Well, this has been such an amazing conversation. Are there any other, I always like to end by asking my guests if there are any other self-care practices that kind of save you or help keep you sane. I know we talked about some of them. Are there any other self-care practices that help keep you going as entrepreneurs so that you can show up and be your best selves, both in business and in life?
I mean, a few of them we've mentioned. I like listening to Oprah's podcast and just like taking in that kind of personal development, like spiritual guidance. I like meditating as much as I can and just practicing mindfulness. And therapy once a week has been
I love
the best self-care that I could ever do for myself.
I love it. So important. Mark, how about you?
I mean, definitely therapy, and I do EMDR. So anyone who has experienced complicated grief or any types of trauma, I would really recommend that. But in addition to that, I think sort of an underrated self-care thing is communication. Jess and I, because it allows you to get social support in the way that you need. And like Jess and I have a really close friendship. She's also my boss. And the way we're able to navigate that effectively and respectfully with good boundaries is that we're really good at communicating with each other. If someone says or does something that makes the other person feel bad, we talk about it right away and kind of hash it out. And I think that's great self-care because it allows you to have great connections with people, which is, so much about what makes life worth living.
Yeah, and if I could just jump on that, that is really, really big. Like, we have really clear communication. We're like, we have, after we deal with the conflict, we go, we have such good communication. but then it jumps off of therapy because I have learned to communicate things better because of things that my therapist has worked with me on. Like, she gave me the 4 agreements. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
Yeah, I've read it.
Don't take things personally. And when you kind of read that and learn what that means, a lot of what might get under your skin or bother you, you realize you're taking something that someone else said personally when it wasn't personal at all. And so just something happened this morning where Margie said something a certain way and I took it personally, and intellectually I know don't take things personally, but then I did, and I was just it was something that was just off between us. And I was like, this is a personal problem. I take it personally. And when you say things in this way, I take it personally. Margie's like, I won't say it like that anymore.
That's so true, though. When you focus on the intention behind the actual action, especially when you've built up that layer of trust. I mean, the same is definitely true in marriage. I think I could kind of relate to that with my husband, where we learned, and I always thought that was a weird phrase, fight right, or good fighter, or whatever. But we learned that whatever's going on, we know that it's not actually about us. It's about something else going on underneath. It's a fear or a worry or something.
Totally.
And so if we can dig a layer deeper into that, then you actually come out ahead, as opposed to not even having had the conflict in the first place, right?
Yeah, we talk a lot about what our triggers are. If something bothers, what is that triggering in you?
Yes, because there's so much there that we're just not even aware of sometimes. And so we can recognize that in ourselves and in each other. I think it helps us have a little bit more balance and of ourselves, which is so important.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, where can wealthy bosses learn more from you?
Well, I mean, we talked a lot. I think a lot of what we talked about today, if they like it, check out Women'splaining. I would recommend our podcast, Women'splaining. It's on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and Google Play, or you can go to womensplaining.com.
Perfect. Jessica and Marty, thank you so much. I love this conversation. I hope we get to have you back on soon.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.